The coffee cup sat in front of me like a dare I hadn't agreed to. Steam curled in ribbons from its lip, carrying a metallic tang that didn't belong to anything roasted or warm. I tried to breathe through my mouth so I wouldn't smell it. "Don't you want to try the coffee I made especially for you, honey?" my husband asked, and the endearment snagged on the odd smile that didn't reach his eyes. We were at my sister-in-law's monthly brunch, the one with linen napkins and cut fruit, arranged like mosaics, the one where the women wore delicate bracelets that clicked when they raised their glasses. I was 29, a marketing manager who survived on lists and preparation, and I had not prepared for this sitting at Nina's polished table, wondering if the man I married was waiting to watch me swallow a mistake. When I met James 3 years ago at a wedding in Nashville, he was the kind of charming that makes you ignore the little things. The late texts, the laughter with his sister that seemed too private, the way Nina's compliments felt like measurements. I told myself I was dramatic. My mother used to say I felt everything with the skin peeled back, too sensitive, too alert. It made me good at my job and terrible at ignoring patterns. And the pattern since I married into this family was sickness that arrived the morning after a meal at Nina's house. It began as queasy coincidences, acid burps, a tightening in my stomach, a rose-hued rash that vanished by noon. Then urgent care. Then hospital lights. Each time the doctors shrugged. Could be stress, they said. Could be a virus. James stroked my hair and told me I worked too hard. Nina clasped my hand and said, "You must try my ginger tea next time, dear. It cures everything." I held the coffee cup and watched the swirl settle, pretending the tremor in my hand was from caffeine I hadn't yet consumed. "James has become quite the barista lately," Nina offered from across the table, stirring her untouched cup with an unnecessary elegance. "He's been trying different methods just for you." The words "for you" slid out of her mouth with the softness of velvet and the bite of a concealed pin. I smiled the way women are taught to smile when the room is watching. "How thoughtful," I said, and somewhere inside me an alarm that had been ringing for months rose to a siren. Patterns. The tea last month that tasted faintly medicinal. The sudden allergies after Christmas brunch. The night I found an unlabeled amber dropper bottle tucked in the back of James's desk drawer, and he laughed and said it was herbal oil for his sore shoulder. How silly of me. He smelled like guilt when he said it, a sharpness under his cologne I couldn't ignore. I started keeping a log in my notes app, dates, symptoms, texts. It felt like betrayal to write it down, but worse to keep trusting nothing was wrong. "Try it while it's hot," James said, and a dozen eyes lifted from pastries and gossip to watch me. I brought the cup close enough for heat to touch my lip, though not close enough to drink it. I could taste metal in the air. Between us, Nina was stirring and not stirring, a performance of casual, every circle of the spoon precise as a compass. She and James shared a quick glance there, and gone, a needle slipped under skin. That glance did more to steady me than any deep breath. Panic became decision. "Oh, work!" I blurted, tapping my phone screen with theatrical surprise. "I need to make a quick call. Nina, can I use the study?" Her eyes flicked to the coffee, then to my face, and she smiled with a slow grace that made me think of snakes. "Of course," she said. I stood reaching for my napkin, and in the same motion let the corner catch the base of my cup. It skidded toward her plate. I gasped, fumbling my elbow, bumping her saucer, her hand rising to save her spoon, whoops and sorries, and the choreography of clumsiness, and when the cup stopped moving, there was a tiny, perfect swap sitting on the linen, like it had always been that way. Such a klutz, I laughed, cheeks burning the right amount. Nina waved her forgiveness with the wrist of a woman who forgives nothing. "Try not to break anything," she said lightly, and I carried my phone toward the darkened doorway of the study, while my pulse pounded between my ribs like a second heart. Inside, I didn't call anyone. I stood in the shadow where I could still see the dining room through the parted door. I pressed record on my phone and aimed the lens a sliver to catch the table. My breath hitched as Nina lifted the cup that had been mine seconds ago. Part of me wanted to burst back into the room, to slap it from her hand, to scream. Another part, cold, injured, ancient, needed the truth more than it needed politeness. This wasn't about punishing an enemy or catching a villain. It was about surviving a pattern that had worn me thin. My body knew what my mind refused to name. I let the record button glow red and waited. She sipped. Nothing happened. She sipped again slower as if weighing the taste. James said something I couldn't hear, and her lips parted then pressed. For a moment, nothing. Then the slightest tremor in the porcelain as she set it down. A hush fell over the table. Not silence exactly, but the quiet of breath being held. Nina's face drained one shade, then another, the way a storm crawls across a field. Her fingers tightened around her napkin. James, she said, and his name broke in the middle, a small, frightened crack. He looked at the cup again, and his chair scraped backwards with a sound that made my teeth hurt. I stepped into the doorway, phone still recording, my mouth suddenly dry as paper. The room pivoted toward me, the way rooms always do, toward the woman who is not supposed to know anything. I could feel my heart trip over itself and stand up again. "Is everything okay?" I asked as gently as I could manage. It felt like a prayer and a trap at once. Nina's lips were trembling now, her knuckles white as she clutched the edge of the tablecloth. "Something's wrong, James," she whispered, and her voice cracked like thin glass. The room stilled, all polite brunch chatter dissolving into silence. James was frozen, his hand hovering near the cup, as though he could will the evidence away with a single touch. My recording phone caught every second the widening of Nina's eyes, the panic clawing through her composure, the way James leaned in too close, his whisper sharp enough that I almost didn't catch it. "That wasn't supposed to be your cup." I felt my breath hitch in my throat, a mixture of nausea and vindication crashing into each other. The faces around the table blurred, but James's stayed in sharp relief, his mask slipping his charm, bleeding into fear. Nina tried to rise but swayed, catching herself on the chair. "What did you put in that coffee?" she demanded, her voice louder now, quivering but unmistakable. Gasps rippled through the relatives, gathered forks clinking down on china eyes, darting between the siblings like an audience too terrified to blink. James's mouth opened and closed, words stuttering into the air. It was just supposed to." He trailed off, his hand dragging across his jaw. "Just mild. Nothing serious. Just enough to—" He looked at me, then a flash of fury and dread mixed into one. "Make you miss the meeting." The floor seemed to tilt beneath me. My knees weakened, but rage locked them in place. Months of strange illnesses, of rashes and stomach pains, of my body betraying me under fluorescent hospital lights, all of it tied together by his half-formed confession. My husband, the man who once whispered promises in our kitchen at midnight, had been feeding me poison. And his sister, who laughed at my clumsiness and offered me ginger tea with a smile, had been in on it. "You promised it wouldn't be traced!" Nina shouted suddenly, her voice rising higher, desperate. She slammed her palm on the table, rattling cups and plates, then turned to him with wild eyes. "You said nobody would ever know." The words cut through me like a blade. Nobody would ever know. Until now. I stepped forward, my phone held tight at my side, recording every shattering moment. "I think everyone knows now," I said softly, though my voice shook under the weight of fury. Heads turned toward me. I was no longer the outsider fumbling with a coffee cup. I was the storm they hadn't expected. Nina's chest heaved as she tried to stand again, but her knees buckled. Someone screamed for an ambulance. James rushed toward her, but his movements were frantic, disjointed, more concerned with appearances than care. He kept muttering, "It wasn't supposed to go this far, it wasn't supposed to," as if saying it could rewrite reality. I stayed by the doorway, my pulse hammering. My mind was split in two. One half wanted to collapse from betrayal, the other wanted to burn the entire truth into the open. I chose the latter. As sirens wailed faintly in the distance, I slipped my phone into my pocket, its recording red and steady, catching every whispered word. When the paramedics burst in, Nina clutched at the sleeve of one and gasped. She knew. She switched. "Oh my God." Her voice cracked into sobs, her finger weakly pointing toward me, then to James. Confusion rippled through the medics, but I met their eyes squarely. "I think you'll want to hear the recording," I said, my voice steady for the first time all morning. James spun toward me, panic fully replacing his charm. You don't understand, he said, his words sharp and brittle. We were protecting you. You're too ambitious. You don't rest. We just wanted to slow you down. The lies tasted worse than the coffee ever could. I stared at him, at the man I thought I knew, and realized that his version of protection was nothing more than betrayal dressed up in excuses. Around us, relatives muttered eyes wide, some whispering prayers, others clutching their children closer. The illusion of family brunch shattered into shards we'd never gather back together. Nina was lifted onto a stretcher, her body trembling, her breaths shallow. James tried to follow, but two paramedics held him back. "We need to keep space," one said firmly. He struggled against them, sweat slicking his temples. "It wasn't supposed to be her!" he shouted, his voice breaking into the silence. "It wasn't supposed to be her!" And in that moment, the last piece of my denial dissolved. They hadn't been clumsy accidents. They hadn't been viruses or stress. They had been deliberate, calculated betrayals from the two people I should have been safest with. The sirens grew louder, closer, swallowing his shouts as the stretcher wheeled Nina out the door. I followed into the sunlight, clutching my phone in my pocket like a weapon, the truth recorded in every pixel. My hands shook, but my resolve was carved from stone. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. At the hospital, the air smelled of disinfectant and urgency. Nina lay pale on the bed, her eyes fluttering open and closed as machines beeped steadily around her. I stood in the corner, phone still warm in my hand, replaying the voices that had carved themselves into my bones. "That wasn't supposed to be your cup. You promised it wouldn't be traced." The words looped over and over, a grotesque chorus of betrayal I could never unhear. A detective arrived not long after the paramedics. He was tall, with lines etched deep into his face, the kind of man who had seen too many lies unravel in hospital rooms. "Mrs. Hartley?" he asked, pulling out a notepad. I nodded, my throat dry. "I understand there was an incident." His eyes flicked to Nina, then back to me. "We'll need to know everything." For the first time in months, I felt like I wasn't gaslighting myself. I told him about the strange illnesses, the bitter teas, the metallic tang of that coffee. I handed him my phone and pressed play, watching his brows knit tighter with every second of the recording. James's voice filled the sterile room. "It wasn't supposed to be your cup, just enough to make her miss the meeting." Nina's furious scream followed. "You promised it wouldn't be traced." The detective stopped the playback, his jaw tightening. "That's enough for us to start," he said gravely. "You did the right thing recording this." James burst into the room moments later, his tie loosened, sweat darkening his collar. "Where is she? Is she okay?" His eyes darted to me, full of accusation. "What did you tell them?" His voice cracked, a desperate edge that made the hairs on my neck rise. The detective stepped forward, placing himself between us. "Sir, I'll need you to calm down. We'll be taking your statement next." James's mask crumbled further. "You don't get it," he snapped, pointing at me with a trembling finger. "She's ruining everything. We were trying to help her. She's obsessed with work. She doesn't stop. It was for her own good." His words collapsed under the weight of their own absurdity. I wanted to scream, to claw at him for twisting poison into protection, but all I could do was stand rooted, my chest heaving with the weight of truth finally dragged into light. Nina groaned from the bed, her voice weak but sharp as glass. "You said nobody would know." Her eyes flicked open, glazed, but focused enough to find James. "You dragged me into this. And now look." Her face twisted, not in guilt, but in panic. She wasn't sorry. She was terrified of consequences. The detective turned to James, his tone clipped. "Sir, you need to come with me." Two officers appeared in the doorway as if conjured by the command. James tried to protest, to lunge toward Nina's bed, but they caught his arms and held him fast. "This is insane!" he shouted, his voice breaking. "We were protecting her. She's lying." She switched the cups. His words bounced off sterile walls, sounding weaker each time. As they dragged him from the room, his eyes met mine one last time, a mix of hatred and fear that chilled me more than the smell of that poisoned coffee ever could. For years I thought the worst betrayal a marriage could face was infidelity. I was wrong. The real betrayal was this someone you trusted with your life deciding it was expendable. The hours blurred into reports, signatures, and endless questions. By the time night draped itself over the hospital, I sat alone in the waiting area, the weight of everything pressing into my chest. I should have felt relief, vindication even, but instead, grief carved through me. Grief for the years wasted loving a man who plotted in shadows. Grief for the family I thought I had gained only to discover it was built on lies. A nurse approached quietly, her hand resting on my shoulder. "She's stable for now," she said softly. I nodded, unable to muster words. Stable, alive, but nothing would ever be stable again. When I finally left the hospital, the night air wrapped around me cold and sharp. The world felt different, thinner somehow, like a veil had been torn away. My phone buzzed with messages, friends checking in, colleagues wondering why I'd missed the meeting James had wanted so badly to sabotage. I typed a short reply. "Family emergency. I'll explain soon." But the truth was, how could I ever explain? How could I put into words the way betrayal poisons not just the body, but the soul? I walked home alone, my footsteps echoing on the pavement. The house loomed dark when I arrived, but it no longer felt like home. It felt like evidence, like every wall had soaked in secrets I hadn't yet uncovered. I stood in the doorway for a long time before stepping inside, promising myself one thing: I wouldn't let their betrayal bury me. I would use it to rise. The next morning, sunlight poured through the blinds, but it felt cold against my skin. I sat at the kitchen table staring at the two mugs still sitting in the sink. One had the faintest ring of coffee clinging to the porcelain, the one I should have drunk. My stomach knotted. I thought of the nights I'd spent hunched over the toilet, the dizzy spells, the unexplained rashes. How many times had I sipped from a cup just like that, thinking it was love in liquid form, not betrayal carefully brewed? The knock at the door startled me. It was the detective again, flanked by another officer. He held a folder, his expression unreadable. "We've confirmed the toxicology results," he said, stepping inside. My hands gripped the chair until my knuckles turned white. "What was it?" I whispered. "A controlled substance," he replied. "Not immediately lethal in small doses, but prolonged ingestion could cause severe organ damage, even death if continued." His words sank like stones into me. My chest tightened, anger lacing with relief. Proof. Proof that I wasn't paranoid. Proof that my pain had been engineered. "We'll need you to testify," he continued. "The recording helps, but your account of the repeated symptoms will build the case." I nodded, though my throat burned. Testify, relive every moment, every ache, every shadow that had whispered doubt into my mind. But I knew I had no choice. To stay silent would be to let them win again. Later that day, I returned to the hospital. Nina was awake, her complexion ghostly under fluorescent lights. She looked at me with eyes that once judged every outfit I wore, now filled with something uglier: resentment. "You switched it!" she hissed when the nurse left the room. Her voice was hoarse but sharp enough to slice. "You wanted this to happen." I felt my pulse hammer in my temples, but I kept my voice steady. "I wanted the truth," I said, "and now everyone can see it." Her lips curled, not in remorse but in bitterness. "You'll regret this. You've ruined him. And me." I almost laughed at the absurdity. I had ruined them. My body still carried the echoes of months of quiet poisoning, and she was furious not at the act, but at the exposure. It was then I realized Nina would never see herself as guilty. In her mind, loyalty to her brother outweighed morality, and I was the intruder who upset their perfect illusion. When I left her room, I bumped into James being escorted down the hall in handcuffs. His hair was disheveled, his tie gone, but his eyes still burned with that terrifying mix of anger and desperation. "We were protecting you," he shouted again, his voice cracking, echoing down the sterile corridor. Everyone turned to look. "You work too hard, you don't sleep. We just wanted to slow you down." His words rattled inside me, absurd in their twisted logic. Poison disguised as protection. Betrayal dressed as love. I met his gaze one last time and whispered, barely audible, "No. You wanted control." His face hardened, but the officers pulled him away before he could speak again. In the weeks that followed, the investigation consumed my life. Detectives combed through bank statements, text messages, even Nina's online orders. The dropper bottle I had once dismissed as herbal oil was analyzed and found to contain the same substance from the coffee. Every detail was another nail in their coffin. But with every revelation, I felt pieces of myself splintering. Nights became long haunted by memories of smiling faces across the brunch table. I replayed birthdays, anniversaries, holidays, moments when I thought family meant safety. Had they been plotting then too? How many toasts had been raised with glasses that could have been laced? At work, whispers followed me. Some colleagues offered sympathy, their eyes wide with shock. Others leaned too close, their curiosity thinly veiled. I hated the pity most of all. I didn't want to be the woman almost poisoned by her husband. I wanted to be the woman who survived, who fought back, who didn't crumble under betrayal. One evening I stood before my bathroom mirror studying my own reflection. My eyes were ringed with fatigue, but deeper than that there was steel. "You're still here," I whispered to myself. "They tried to break you, and you're still here." Saying it aloud felt like reclaiming something they had tried to take. When the court date finally came, I walked into the courtroom with my head high. James sat at the defense table, his suit ill-fitted, his charm hollow. Nina was beside him, pale and trembling, her lips pressed into a tight line. They wouldn't meet my eyes, but I didn't need them to. The truth was no longer locked in whispers and suspicions, it was laid bare for the world to see. The courtroom was colder than I expected, not in temperature, but in atmosphere. Every whisper carried, every cough echoed. I sat at the witness stand, my palms pressed flat against my thighs, reminding myself to breathe. Across the room, James looked at me like a stranger, his jaw-tight eyes burning. Nina sat beside him, her hands folded too neatly, as if the right pose could erase what she had done. The prosecutor began gently. "Can you describe in your own words what happened on the morning of the incident?" I swallowed hard. My husband made me a cup of coffee. It smelled wrong, metallic. He insisted I drink it, and my sister-in-law mentioned he'd been practicing just for me. Something in me snapped. I switched our cups under the table. Minutes later, she began trembling, and that's when the truth spilled out. The prosecutor nodded, then played my recording. The sound of James's whisper filled the courtroom. "That wasn't supposed to be your cup." Then Nina's voice, sharp and panicked. "You promised it wouldn't be traced." The words hung heavy in the air. Jurors shifted in their seats. A reporter scribbled furiously. The defense lawyer tried to twist it. "Mrs. Hartley, isn't it possible you misinterpreted their words? That perhaps this was a misunderstanding, an exaggeration?" Exaggeration. My voice rose before I could stop it. I spent months sick. My skin broke out in rashes. I fainted at work. I thought I was losing my mind. And all that time, the people I trusted most were plotting behind my back. That recording isn't exaggeration, it's confession. For the first time, Nina's composure cracked. "We weren't trying to kill her," she shouted suddenly, her voice shrill, echoing off the wooden walls. Gasps rippled through the room. James shot her a furious glare, but it was too late. It was supposed to be mild, just to keep her from working herself to death. Nina added, tears spilling, but the words sounded hollow, absurd. The judge banged his gavel for order, but the damage was done. Their attempt to control the narrative had shattered in front of everyone. When the toxicology report was read aloud, confirming the presence of harmful substances in the coffee residue, there was no more room for doubt. The prosecutor's voice was firm, steady. This was systematic, planned, and it could have been fatal. James's lawyer leaned into him, whispering furiously, but James only shook his head, his face ashen. He looked smaller somehow, not the man who once stood tall at family dinners commanding attention. He looked like a boy caught in his own trap. When it was time for closing statements, I felt every eye in the room on me. My chest tightened, but I lifted my chin. I didn't speak to the jury. I spoke to myself, to the woman who had doubted her instincts for too long. "The greatest betrayal," I said softly, "isn't from enemies. It's from those who call themselves family, while they poison you in silence." I trusted them, and they decided my life was expendable. Silence followed, heavy and absolute. The verdict came swiftly. Guilty. Both of them. Attempted poisoning conspiracy, reckless endangerment. The words rolled through the courtroom like thunder. James slumped in his chair, staring at the floor. Nina wept openly, muttering, "This isn't fair, this isn't fair," as officers moved to take them away. For the first time in months, I felt the weight in my chest loosen. Justice, even imperfect, had found its voice. Outside, reporters swarmed, cameras, flashing microphones thrust toward me. "Do you have a statement?" they asked. I paused, the cold air biting my skin. Sometimes, I said, my voice steady, the biggest threats come from the people sitting right at your table. Trust your instincts. They can save your life. And then I walked past the chaos, leaving the flashing lights behind. In the weeks after, the silence in my home was deafening. Their shadows still lingered in the mugs I threw away, in the chair James once occupied, in the perfume Nina had left on a scarf. I burned that scarf in the fireplace one night, watching the smoke curl upward like ghosts leaving the room. Healing wasn't instant. Nights were hardest when memories looped and doubts whispered, "What if I hadn't switched the cups? What if I hadn't pressed record?" But every time fear rose, I reminded myself I had survived. I had faced betrayal, dragged it into the light, and lived to tell the story. Months later, I was invited to speak at a women's safety conference. Standing at the podium, I looked at the rows of faces, women who had their own stories, their own scars. "I'm not here as a victim," I told them. "I'm here as proof. Proof that even when betrayal comes from where you least expect it, you can rise. You can fight. You can survive." Applause filled the room, warm and thunderous. And in that moment, I knew the truth: betrayal may wound us deeply, but it also uncovers the strength we didn't know we had. If this story moved you, please like, share, and subscribe. And tell me your own story in the comments. Together, we remind each other that no betrayal can silence us forever.